The wine tour through the Italian countryside was supposed to be Sarah and David Wilson's second honeymoon, a chance for the retired military colonel to finally relax after 25 years of command. Then the van stopped, armed men got out, and Sarah screamed his name as they dragged her away. In that moment, David Wilson stopped being a tourist and became what he'd always been, a predator trained to hunt down those who harmed the innocent. The men who took his wife thought they were kidnapping a helpless tourist couple. They had no idea that David Wilson had commanded Delta Force operations and that taking his wife was the last mistake they'd ever make. Welcome to Real Security Stories, where we uncover the moments when vacation dreams become operational nightmares, and retired warriors discover that some battles choose you. Before we dive into this incredible story of love, loss, and lethal determination, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe that some people should never be underestimated, especially when their family is threatened, hit that subscribe button. This story will change how you see quiet tourists forever. David Wilson had hung up his military uniform 18 months ago, trading the weight of command for the promise of a peaceful retirement with a woman who had waited 25 years for him to come home permanently. At 47, he carried the weathered face and careful posture of someone who had seen too much combat, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of Delta Force's most successful operational commanders. Sarah Wilson, 45, was everything David had dreamed of during the long deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and a dozen other places that didn't officially exist on military maps. She was a trauma nurse at Johns Hopkins, someone who understood duty and sacrifice, because she lived it every day. Their marriage had survived multiple deployments, extended separations, and the constant knowledge that David might not come home from any given mission. The Italian wine tour was Sarah's idea. "We never had a real honeymoon," she had said, holding up the brochure for a romantic week in Tuscany. 25 years ago, you had to report for training 3 days after our wedding. We deserved this. David had initially resisted. After 2.5 decades of hypervigilance, of being responsible for the lives of soldiers and the success of missions that could change the course of international conflicts, the idea of being a tourist felt almost alien. But Sarah's smile had convinced him, as it always did. The Tuscany region was everything the brochure had promised: rolling hills covered with vineyards, ancient stone villages, and a pace of life that seemed designed to wash away the stress of modern existence. For the first time in his adult life, David Wilson was learning to relax. Their 4th day in Italy began with a sunrise over the Villa San Giuseppe, a 400-year-old vineyard that specialized in small group tours for discerning tourists. David and Sarah had joined 6 other couples for a full-day experience that included wine tasting, a traditional Italian lunch, and a guided tour of the region's most historic vineyards. The tour guide, Marco, was a cheerful local who spoke excellent English and had an encyclopedic knowledge of both winemaking and regional history. The other tourists were typical international travelers: a retired German couple, 2 young honeymooners from Australia, and a middle-aged pair from Canada, celebrating their anniversary. David found himself genuinely enjoying the experience. The wine was exceptional, the countryside was beautiful, and Sarah was more relaxed and happy than he had seen her in years. For the first time since his retirement, he wasn't thinking about tactical situations, threat assessments, or exit strategy. He was just a husband on vacation with his wife. The group had visited 3 vineyards during the morning and early afternoon, sampling wines and learning about the traditional methods that had been passed down through generations of Italian family. The conversation was light, the atmosphere was convivial, and even David's military-trained suspicion was lulled by the peaceful surroundings. As they approached their final stop of the day, a small family vineyard, known for its exclusive reserve wines, David was already planning their evening. A quiet dinner at the hotel restaurant, perhaps a walk through the village, and then, well, this was their second honeymoon. After all, he had no way of knowing that they were being watched. What David didn't realize was that the Villa San Giuseppe wine tour had been targeted by a sophisticated kidnapping ring that specialized in wealthy international tourists. The operation was led by Antonio Rossi, a former Italian military officer who had been dishonorably discharged for selling weapons to terrorist organizations. Rossi had recruited a team of ex-soldiers and criminals who operated with military precision. Their method was simple but effective. They would identify high-value targets during the booking process. Tourists who were staying at expensive hotels, wearing expensive clothing, or who had indicated on their forms that they were celebrating special occasions. The wine tour provided the perfect cover for reconnaissance, allowing them to assess their target's behavior, physical capabilities, and potential value. David and Sarah had been marked from the moment they checked into their luxury hotel. A retired American military officer and a medical professional, traveling during off-season when tourist numbers were lower, staying at a 5-star property and celebrating a significant anniversary. They fit the profile perfectly. The kidnapping ring had executed 17 similar operations over the past 3 years, always targeting foreign tourists who would be missed but whose disappearance wouldn't immediately trigger a massive law enforcement response. The Italian authorities were aware of the problem, but had been unable to identify the perpetrators or predict their next target. Rossi's team had spent the entire day observing the tour group, noting the personalities, physical conditions, and potential resistance capabilities of each couple. The German couple was too old and frail to provide significant resistance. The Australians were young and fit but appeared to be naive and unprepared. The Canadians seemed prosperous but soft. David and Sarah Wilson appeared to be the ideal targets. Prosperous Americans who were clearly celebrating something special, well-dressed and well-spoken, but apparently unaware of any potential threats. The fact that David carried himself with unusual posture and alertness was noted but misinterpreted as military bearing rather than operational readiness. The kidnappers had made a critical error in assessment. The final vineyard was located in a remote valley, accessible only by a narrow road that wound through forested hills. It was the perfect location for what Rossi had planned. The isolation meant no witnesses, the narrow road prevented escape, and the rugged terrain provided multiple options for extraction routes. As the tour van approached the vineyard, Marco received a phone call that he claimed was from the vineyard owner. "There's been a small problem with the wine tasting," he announced to the group. "We need to make a brief stop to resolve it." The van pulled over at what appeared to be a scenic overlook. Marco got out, ostensibly to make another phone call. And that's when David's situational awareness finally kicked in. Something about the location felt wrong. The road was too isolated, the stop was too convenient, and Marco's behavior had subtly changed from cheerful tour guide to nervous accomplice. David was reaching for Sarah's hand to quietly communicate his concern when the attack began. 3 vehicles emerged from concealed positions in the trees, 2 SUVs and a panel van, all moving with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Armed men in tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, their movements practiced and efficient. "Down. Everyone down," they shouted in accented English. Assault rifles trained on the terrified tourists. David's Delta Force training took over instantly. His mind automatically cataloged the threats, assessed the tactical situation, and began formulating response options. 6 armed men, professional equipment, coordinated movement patterns, escape routes blocked, civilians present. But before he could act, one of the kidnappers had reached Sarah. What happened next occurred with the brutal efficiency of professionals who had done this before. The tourists were separated into 2 groups, those who would be released as witnesses and those who would be taken for ransom. The selection criteria was clearly based on perceived value and ransom potential. The German couple was pushed aside. Too old, too much medical risk. The young Australians were zip-tied and thrown into the panel van. Young, healthy, families back home would pay. The Canadians were initially selected, then rejected when one of the kidnappers noticed the man's medical alert bracelet. David and Sarah were the primary targets. "No, David!" Sarah screamed as 2 men grabbed her arms and began dragging her toward the SUV. Her medical training had taught her to remain calm in crisis situations, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of professional violence. David took a step forward, his military instincts calculating angles of attack and vulnerability points, but stopped when the leader of the kidnappers pressed a pistol against Sarah's head. "You move, she dies," the man said in heavily accented English. "You follow instructions. Maybe she lives." For 25 years, David Wilson had been the one making tactical decisions, commanding operations, and controlling situations through superior training and firepower. Now he was watching helplessly as the most important person in his life was taken from him by professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. The kidnappers had planned for resistance, for panic, for confusion. They had not planned for what David Wilson was about to become. As the SUV carrying Sarah disappeared down the mountain road, David Wilson underwent a transformation that would have been recognizable to any soldier who had served under his command. The tourist veneer fell away completely, replaced by the cold, calculating operational mindset that had made him one of Delta Force's most feared commanders. The remaining kidnappers were securing the other tourists and preparing to leave the scene. They had left David for last, apparently confident that an unarmed middle-aged tourist posed no significant threat. They were wrong. David's assessment of the situation took less than 3 seconds. 2 armed men remaining, both focused on the other civilians. A third man by the vehicles, handling communications. Weapons visible but not immediately trained on him. Approximately 45 seconds before they would attempt to secure or eliminate him. 25 years of combat experience told David that he had one chance to turn this situation in his favor. The first kidnapper never saw David move. One moment he was securing zip ties on the Canadian couple. The next he was unconscious on the ground, his weapon in David's hands. The second kidnapper spun toward the commotion but was already too late. David's movement was fluid, practiced, and absolutely lethal. The communications operator reached for his weapon but stopped when David's voice cut through the air with unmistakable authority. "Move, and you die," David said, his tone carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had made similar statements hundreds of times in combat zone. "Drop the radio. Step away from the vehicle." The man complied immediately, recognizing the voice of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. In less than 30 seconds, David had neutralized 3 armed kidnappers and taken control of the situation. But his real mission was just beginning. David's first priority was securing intelligence about Sarah's location and the kidnapping operation. His Delta Force training had taught him that information was always more valuable than violence, and that the first hours after a kidnapping were critical for successful rescue operations. The communications operator, a nervous local criminal named Pietro, was clearly the weak link in the operation. Under David's questioning, which involved no physical violence but a great deal of psychological pressure, Pietro revealed the basic structure of the kidnapping ring. "They take the people to the old monastery," Pietro stammered. "Up in the mountains. There's a signal phone. They call for ransom money." "How many men?" David asked, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable menace. "Maybe 8, 10. They have guns, communications, professional people." David processed this information with the analytical precision of someone who had planned hundreds of combat operations. A fortified position in mountainous terrain, approximately 10 armed opponents, professional equipment and coordination. Under normal circumstances, this would require a full tactical team, air support, and extensive planning. But these weren't normal circumstances. This was personal. David secured the weapons from the neutralized kidnappers, 2 assault rifles, ammunition, and a radio that was still receiving communications from the main group. He also found something even more valuable: a GPS unit that showed the exact location of the monastery where Sarah was being held. David's military training had taught him that successful operations required careful preparation, even under time pressure. He had perhaps 2 hours before the kidnappers realized that their rear guard team had been compromised. That gave him a narrow window to plan and execute a one-man rescue operation. First, he secured the other tourists. The Australian couple was unconscious but alive. The Canadians were traumatized but uninjured, and Marco, the tour guide, was revealed to be a reluctant accomplice who had been coerced into cooperation through threats to his family. "Call the police," David told Marco. "Tell them exactly what happened, but tell them not to approach the monastery until I give an all-clear signal." David knew that involving local law enforcement was necessary, but potentially catastrophic. Italian police weren't trained for this kind of tactical operation, and their intervention could result in Sarah's death. He needed to handle this personally, using supplies from the kidnappers' vehicles and his own improvised equipment. David began preparing for an assault that would have been challenging for a full team of Delta Force operators. He had no backup, no air support, no intelligence beyond what he had extracted from Pietro, and no margin for error. But he had something that the kidnappers didn't expect: 25 years of experience in exactly this kind of operation, and the absolute certainty that failure was not an option. The monastery that the kidnappers had chosen as their base of operations was a partially ruined 14th century structure, built into the side of a steep mountain. It had been abandoned for decades, making it perfect for clandestine activities. The building was accessible only by a single narrow road, providing excellent defensive positions and multiple escape routes through the mountainous terrain. David approached the monastery, using techniques he had perfected in Afghanistan. He moved through the forested approaches with the patience and precision of someone who understood that hasty operations got people killed. His reconnaissance took over an hour, during which he identified guard positions, communication setups, and the most likely location where Sarah was being held. The kidnappers had established a professional operation: perimeter guards, overlapping fields of fire, communication protocols, and what appeared to be a well-organized command structure. But they had made their defensive preparations assuming they would face Italian police, or possibly military units. They had not prepared for a single operator with David's level of training and motivation. From his concealed position, David could see Sarah through a ground floor window. She was alive, appeared uninjured, and was being held in what had once been the monastery's main hall. 2 guards were visible, with additional personnel moving through other parts of the building. David's assault plan was based on speed, surprise, and the principle that the best defense against superior numbers was to attack when and where the enemy least expected it. What happened next was a masterclass in single-operator tactical assault. David's attack began at sunset, when the changing light would affect the guard's vision and create shadows that would mask his movement. The first guard never knew what hit him. David's approach was silent, and his neutralization was instantaneous. The second perimeter guard was eliminated with equal efficiency. Within 5 minutes, David had breached the monastery's outer defenses without alerting the main group. The assault on the building itself required a different approach. David used the monastery's ancient architecture to his advantage, moving through forgotten passages and utilizing the building's structural weaknesses to create multiple entry points. The kidnappers' first indication that something was wrong came when their radio communications began failing. David had systematically destroyed their communication equipment during his initial penetration. By the time they realized they were under attack, David was already inside the building. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. The kidnappers were professional and well-armed, but they were facing an opponent who had spent 2.5 decades perfecting the art of close-quarters combat. David moved through the monastery with lethal efficiency, using his superior training and intimate knowledge of urban warfare to overcome the numerical disadvantage. When the shooting stopped, 7 kidnappers were neutralized, 3 had fled into the mountains, and David was bleeding from a graze wound on his shoulder that he barely noticed. None of that mattered, because Sarah was safe. David found Sarah exactly where his reconnaissance had indicated, in the monastery's main hall, zip-tied to a wooden chair but otherwise unharmed. Her relief at seeing him was overwhelming, but her medical training kicked in immediately when she saw his wound. "David, you're bleeding. Let me look at that." "I'm fine," David said, cutting her restraints with tactical efficiency. "We need to move. There are still hostiles in the area." But as Sarah stood and wrapped her arms around her husband, she realized that the man who had just rescued her was not the relaxed tourist she had been falling in love with all over again during their Italian vacation. This was Colonel David Wilson, Delta Force Commander, operational professional, and lethal protector. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite everything she had been through. 7 neutralized, 3 fled. Local authorities are en route." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately that David had just conducted a military operation to rescue her. She had always known about his military service in abstract terms, but she had never seen him in operational mode until this moment. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," David replied, "and I will never let anyone hurt you again." The Italian authorities arrived at the monastery 45 minutes later to find a crime scene that looked like the aftermath of a military assault. 7 dead kidnappers, extensive tactical equipment, and evidence of a highly professional operation that had been conducted with surgical precision. David Wilson sat on the monastery steps with his wife, calmly providing a detailed briefing to the Carabinieri tactical team leader who had been expecting to conduct a hostage rescue operation and instead found that the hostages had already been rescued by a single American tourist. The investigation that followed revealed that David had dismantled an international kidnapping ring that had been responsible for dozens of abductions across southern Europe. The 3 kidnappers who had escaped were captured within 48 hours, and the organization's financial network was frozen by international law enforcement cooperation. David's actions were praised by Italian authorities, international law enforcement agencies, and military officials from multiple countries. The precision and effectiveness of his one-man assault became a case study in tactical operations and crisis response. But the media attention was the last thing David wanted. He had simply done what any husband would do when his wife was threatened. The fact that he happened to have the training and experience to execute a successful rescue operation was incidental. 3 weeks after the monastery assault, David received a phone call from the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense wanted to meet with him about consulting opportunities with special operations training programs. The CIA called about contractor positions. Private military companies offered lucrative packages for his expertise. David declined all of them. "I'm retired," he told Sarah over dinner at their favorite restaurant back home in Maryland. "I spent 25 years serving my country. Now I want to spend the rest of my life serving my family." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "What if your country needs you again?" David considered the question seriously. "If there's ever a situation where my specific skills are needed to protect innocent people, I'll consider it. But I'm not looking for new wars to fight. I've done my share." The Italian government awarded David their highest civilian honor for his actions. The U.S. military offered him reinstatement at his former rank with immediate promotion opportunity. International security companies presented him with consulting contracts worth millions of dollars. David accepted the Italian honor because it came with a lifetime invitation to return to Tuscany as a guest of the government. The rest he politely declined. 6 months after the monastery incident, David and Sarah Wilson returned to Italy for their real second honeymoon. The Italian government had insisted on providing them with a luxury villa in Tuscany, complete with security arrangements and a personal guide who happened to be a retired Carabinieri officer. This time, David allowed himself to truly relax. The kidnappers were in prison. The threat was eliminated, and he had proven to himself that retirement didn't mean helplessness. His military skills were still there when needed, but they didn't have to define his everyday life. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from the hospital to spend more time with David as he adjusted to civilian life. The trauma of the kidnapping had affected both of them, but it had also strengthened their relationship in unexpected ways. "I always knew you were special," Sarah told him as they watched the sunset from their villa's terrace. "But I never really understood what that meant until I saw you in action." "I never wanted you to see that side of me," David replied. "I wanted to keep that part of my life separate from our life together." "You can't separate the parts of yourself that I love," Sarah said. "I fell in love with a soldier who became a protector. The fact that you would risk everything to save me is exactly who you are." Today, David Wilson continues to enjoy his retirement, but his perspective on civilian life has evolved. He has become an advocate for veteran transition services, and speaks regularly about the challenges of adapting military skills to civilian careers. He also works part-time as a consultant for law enforcement agencies that need expertise in hostage rescue and tactical operations. His experience at the monastery has made him a sought-after authority on single-operator missions and crisis response. Sarah has returned to her work at Johns Hopkins, but she has also become involved in supporting military families and helping them understand the transition challenges that service members face when returning to civilian life. The kidnapping ring that targeted them has been completely dismantled, but David knows that there are always other threats, other criminals who prey on innocent people. He remains vigilant without being paranoid, prepared without being aggressive. The difference between a warrior and a soldier, David tells the veterans he counsels, is that a warrior never stops protecting people, even after the war is over. Military service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just changes form. David's rescue of Sarah from the Italian kidnapping ring became more than just a personal victory. It demonstrated that military training and experience remain valuable long after official service ends, and that veterans can apply their skills to protect civilian communities in ways that go far beyond traditional law enforcement. The tactical techniques David used during the monastery assault have been incorporated into special operations training programs around the world. His single-operator approach to hostage rescue has influenced military doctrine and provided a template for similar situations. But for David and Sarah Wilson, the most important legacy is simpler. They have learned that love is worth fighting for, that some skills never fade, and that retirement from military service doesn't mean retirement from the mission of protecting innocent people. The wine tour through the Italian countryside that was supposed to be their peaceful second honeymoon became a reminder that some people are never really off duty. David Wilson had traded his military uniform for civilian clothes, but he had never stopped being a protector, and when the people he loves are threatened, he never will. As David and Sarah Wilson walk through their Maryland neighborhood on a quiet evening, they look like any other retired couple enjoying their golden years. David tends his garden with the same precision he once applied to military operations. Sarah volunteers at the local hospital, sharing her medical expertise with young nurses. Their neighbors have no idea that the quiet man next door once conducted one of the most successful single-operator hostage rescues in modern military history. They don't know that the kind woman who brings cookies to new residents is a trauma nurse who has saved countless lives in emergency situations. But occasionally, when someone in the neighborhood faces a crisis, a missing teenager, a domestic violence situation, a medical emergency, David and Sarah Wilson step forward with the quiet competence of people who have spent their lives helping others in their darkest moments. Because some people never really retire from service. They just find new ways to serve. The Italian countryside remembers David Wilson as the American tourist who dismantled a kidnapping ring and rescued his wife from a fortified monastery. But David Wilson remembers Italy as the place where he learned that some battles choose you, some skills never fade, and some loves are worth any risk. His second honeymoon didn't go as planned. It went exactly as it needed to. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the most ordinary. David Wilson's story reminds us that military training doesn't end with retirement. Love is the strongest motivation, and some people should never be underestimated, especially when their family is threatened. If this story moved you, subscribe to Real Security Stories for more accounts of ordinary people whose extraordinary backgrounds prepare them for the unthinkable. Where are you watching from today? Have you ever met a veteran whose past caught up with them in unexpected ways? Share their story in the comments below.